The great hall of Rouen Castle fell silent as the young woman entered. Though just 19 years old, her presence commanded attention even now. Shackled, head shaved, dressed in a simple shift that hung loosely from her thin frame. The afternoon light, filtering through narrow windows, cast long shadows across the stone floor, illuminating the faces of 50 robed men who watched her with calculating eyes. Bishops, priests, theologians, and inquisitors, men who claimed to speak for God, had gathered to pronounce judgment on one who claimed the same. Joan of Arc stood alone. No advocate stood beside her. No friendly face offered comfort in that sea of ecclesiastical power. The air hung heavy with the scent of candle wax and the weight of foregone conclusions. Her eyes, once bright with the fire of divine purpose, now carried the exhaustion of 3 months of relentless interrogation, psychological torment, and physical deprivation. Bishop Pierre Cauchon leaned forward on his ornate chair, the very picture of solemn authority. Jehan called the maid, his voice echoed against the stone walls. "Do you submit to the judgment of your Holy Mother Church?" Behind the pious words and sacred vestments lurked a darker reality, one of political machinations, English gold, and ecclesiastical ambition. For how had it come to this? How had a peasant girl who claimed to serve God and the Church with unwavering devotion now faced death at the hands of that very institution? What tangled web of power, fear, and betrayal had brought the Maid of Orleans to this moment of reckoning? The answer lies not in the realm of the divine, but in the all-too-human corridors of power, where the Church had become both weapon and battlefield in a struggle that had little to do with faith and everything to do with crowns, conquest, and control. 13 years earlier, in the small village of Domremy on the eastern frontier of France, life had followed the predictable rhythms of rural existence. Fields were plowed, sheep were tended, and prayers were offered with the simplicity of unquestioning faith. It was here in 1412 that Jacques d'Arc and his wife Isabelle Romay welcomed their daughter Jeannette into a world torn by war and uncertainty. The 100 Years' War had already ravaged the countryside for 75 years. England claimed the French throne, Burgundian allies controlled much of northern France, and the uncrowned Dauphin Charles cowered at Chinon, unable to claim his inheritance or inspire his people. Famine stalked the land, and bands of mercenaries, English, Burgundian, and nominally French, pillaged with impunity. Young Jeannette grew strong and devout, learning her prayers before she could spin wool, joining in the village celebrations around the fairy tree while remaining steadfast in her Catholic devotions. She was known for her industriousness, her kindness, and her fierce piety. Nothing marked her as extraordinary until the summer of her 13th year. "I was in my father's garden," Joan would later testify, "when I heard a voice to my right toward the church. With the voice came a great light." The voice, she claimed, was that of the Archangel Michael, soon joined by Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. At first, they offered only guidance on living a virtuous life. But as Joan grew and the political situation in France deteriorated, the messages became more specific, more urgent. "Go to France," the voices eventually commanded. "Raise the siege of Orléans. Take the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation." For 4 years, Joan kept the voices secret, their messages becoming increasingly insistent, until, at 17, she could no longer ignore them. With the reluctant help of a local nobleman, Robert de Baudricourt, she secured an escort to Chinon, where the uncrowned Charles VII held what remained of his court. Her journey through hostile territory was the first of many miracles attributed to the Maid. Dressed in men's clothing for protection during travel, a pragmatic choice that would later become central to her downfall, she crossed nearly 300 miles of enemy-controlled land in a 11 days during the winter of 1429. At Chinon, Charles tested her by hiding among his courtiers, yet Joan identified him immediately. More impressive was her knowledge of his secret prayer, that God would confirm his legitimacy as the son of Charles VI, a matter of private doubt given his mother's notorious infidelity. What transpired between them remains one of history's great secrets. But whatever Joan revealed convinced the Dauphin to provide her with armor, a horse, a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, and a small force of men. Professional soldiers scoffed at the idea of following a peasant girl into battle. The clergy remained skeptical of her claims of divine guidance. Yet the situation was desperate enough for Charles to gamble on this strange young woman who spoke with such conviction. At Orleans, besieged by the English for months, Joan's arrival transformed a demoralized army. Her tactical instincts proved uncanny for one with no military training. She insisted on direct assaults rather than the cautious strategies favored by veteran commanders. Her fearlessness under fire inspired common soldiers who began to believe they fought with divine favor. "I bring you the best aid ever sent to anyone," Joan had declared upon her arrival, the aid of the King of Heaven. Within 9 days, the siege was lifted. In the months that followed, Joan led a series of swift victories at Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire, and Patay, clearing the path to Reims where, on July 17, 1429, Charles VI was crowned King of France with Joan standing proudly beside him, her banner held high in place of a sword. In just 4 months, this illiterate farm girl had accomplished what generations of nobles, knights, and royal counselors had failed to achieve. France had hope again. The English and their Burgundian allies faced an enemy rejuvenated by faith in divine providence. And the Catholic Church, whose representatives had initially questioned Joan's orthodoxy, now found its rituals and symbols, the coronation, the sacred oil, the blessings, at the center of this national revival. Joan believed she served God through unwavering loyalty to both crown and church. In her mind, there could be no contradiction between these allegiances. The voices that guided her spoke with divine authority, yet she insisted they directed her to strengthen the established order, not challenge it. She attended Mass daily, confessed regularly, and framed her mission in terms of Christian duty. She could not imagine that the institution she served with such devotion would soon become the instrument of her destruction. The victories of 1429 sent shockwaves through the halls of power across Europe. In London, the child King Henry VI's regents faced uncomfortable questions about how a teenage girl could repeatedly defeat English forces. In Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good reconsidered his alliance with England. In Rome, Pope Martin V observed with interest as this self-proclaimed messenger of God altered the balance of power in the long-running conflict. Most threatened of all were the pro-English clergy and academics who had built careers justifying England's claim to the French throne. Chief among these was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, who had fled his diocese when it returned to French control after Joan's victories. Ambitious, learned, and utterly committed to the Anglo-Burgundian cause, Cauchon understood that Joan represented more than a military threat. She was a theological challenge to the Church's authority. For centuries, the Catholic Church had carefully controlled access to divine revelation. Prophets, visionaries, and mystics were subject to rigorous scrutiny by learned theologians who determined whether their messages came from God or Satan. This system ensured that no revelation threatening to church power would gain legitimacy. But Joan had bypassed this process entirely, taking her message directly to the temporal power of the king. The church is God and God is the church, was the medieval understanding. Yet here was a simple peasant girl claiming to receive instructions directly from heaven, without ecclesiastical mediation or approval. If Joan's voices were authentic, what need was there for the elaborate hierarchy of priests, bishops, and popes who claimed exclusive authority to interpret God's will? The political implications were equally threatening. Since the time of Charlemagne, French monarchs had claimed divine right to rule, blessed by the church in a carefully choreographed relationship of mutual legitimization. The coronation at Reims was the physical manifestation of this arrangement, the church bestowing God's blessing on the king, who in turn protected the church's interests. But Joan had inverted this relationship. By her account, God had chosen Charles directly and sent her to ensure his coronation. The church had merely performed a ceremony whose divine authorization had already been granted through Joan's voices. She had made the church an instrument rather than the source of divine legitimacy. In the Great Hall of the University of Paris, Europe's preeminent theological institution and a bastion of pro-English sentiment, learned doctors debated the implications. John Beaupere, a prominent theologian who would later serve as an interrogator at Joan's trial, articulated the core concern. If this girl speaks truly, then God may speak directly to the simplest soul without need of our interpretations. What then becomes of our authority? The English regent, the Duke of Bedford, recognized the danger Joan posed to Anglo-Burgundian control of northern France. Military defeat was one thing. The loss of religious legitimacy was far more damaging. Bedford's political acumen told him that Joan must be discredited, not simply as an enemy combatant, but as a heretic, a false prophet whose apparent successes came not from God, but from demonic assistance. The church, or at least its pro-English faction, thus became the perfect weapon against Joan. If she could be tried by an ecclesiastical court and condemned for heresy, her victories would be retroactively tainted. Charles VII's coronation, inspired by a demon-possessed girl, would lose its sacred authority. The English claim to the French throne would regain its legitimacy. For this strategy to work, however, Joan needed to be captured alive. As long as she remained free, leading French forces to victory, her claims of divine guidance appeared vindicated by success. But once in English hands, subjected to the full weight of ecclesiastical interrogation, she could be broken. Forced to recant and executed as a relapsed heretic, the trap was set. All that remained was for Joan to fall into it. By the spring of 1430, the political landscape had shifted. Charles VII, having secured his coronation, showed decreasing interest in Joan's calls for more aggressive military action. Court factions jealous of her influence whispered doubts about her continuing usefulness. The king's chief advisor, Georges de la Tremoille, viewed her as a threat to his control over royal policy. Military commanders resented taking orders from a woman barely out of childhood. Joan sensed the changing attitudes, but remained committed to her mission. "I will last a year and little more," she had predicted after the coronation. Her voices warned of capture, but offered assurances that all would be well, and that she would ultimately reach paradise. On May 23, 1430, Joan led a small force to relieve the city of Compiègne, besieged by Burgundian troops. As evening approached, she organized a sortie against the enemy positions. The attack initially pushed back the Burgundian lines, but reinforcements soon arrived, forcing the French to retreat toward the city gates. Joan, as always, positioned herself with the rear guard, ensuring her soldiers reached safety before she would withdraw. As the last defenders neared the city, the unthinkable happened. The drawbridge rose, the gates closed. Whether by deliberate treachery or simple panic, the captain of Compiègne had sealed the fortifications with Joan still outside the walls. Surrounded by enemies, Joan fought desperately until an archer pulled her from her horse. A Burgundian nobleman, Lionel of Vendôme, secured her surrender. "I have given my faith to another than you, and I will keep my oath," she declared, referring to her pledge of loyalty to Charles VII. The news of her capture spread rapidly. In English-controlled territories, church bells rang in celebration. In Paris, the pro-English university sent immediate demands that she be tried for heresy. In Rouen, Bedford authorized payment of a substantial ransom to transfer Joan from Burgundian to English custody. And in the royal court at Chinon, silence. No ransom was offered, no rescue attempt organized, no diplomatic pressure applied for her release. The king she had crowned, the cause she had revitalized, the nation she had begun to save, all abandoned her with stunning indifference. Jean Chartier, the royal chronicler, would later write that Charles made no effort to save her, neither by offers of ransom, nor by threats of reprisal, nor by any other means. In fact, the royal accounts show no expenditure, no record of even the smallest gesture toward securing Joan's freedom. This betrayal cut deeper than any wound Joan had suffered in battle. Her absolute loyalty to Charles had defined her mission. She had repeatedly risked her life for his crown, convinced that serving him meant serving God. Now, when she most needed his support, he turned away. Some historians suggest Charles feared Joan's capture might reverse the divine legitimacy her victories had conferred on his coronation. Others point to La Tremoille's influence and the court's relief at being freed from this unpredictable, demanding visionary. Still others note that practical politics made a rescue impossible. Charles lacked the military strength to challenge the English directly, and couldn't afford the enormous ransom demanded. Whatever the reason, the abandonment was complete. By July, Joan had been transferred to English custody for 10,000 livres, a king's ransom paid not by her king but by his enemies. She was moved to Rouen, the seat of English power in Normandy, and confined in the castle tower rather than in an ecclesiastical prison as required by church law for those accused of religious crimes. In her cell, fitted with a cage called a hooch and chained to her bed, Joan finally understood the full extent of her isolation. The English soldiers who guarded her, the same enemies she had repeatedly defeated in battle, subjected her to constant mockery, threats, and at least one attempted sexual assault. Her requests to attend Mass were denied. Her pleas to be held in a church prison under female guards were ignored. Yet even now, Joan's spirit remained unbroken. When Bishop Cauchon first visited her cell in January 1431 to establish jurisdiction over her case, she challenged him directly. "You say you are my judge. Take care what you do, for in truth I am sent by God, and you place yourself in great danger." The stage was set for a trial unlike any other. A prosecution where the verdict was predetermined, the procedures manipulated, and the purpose not justice but political expediency, masked by religious authority. On February 21, 1431, the trial of Joan of Arc officially began in the chapel of Rouen Castle. Pierre Cauchon presided as chief judge, assisted by 42 assessors, theologians, canon lawyers, and churchmen, many from the University of Paris. Though ostensibly an ecclesiastical court seeking truth, its actual purpose was clear to all involved. Joan must be found guilty of heresy to delegitimize Charles VII's coronation and restore English claims to the French throne. Cauchon's first legal maneuver revealed the trial's true nature. As Bishop of Beauvais, he claimed jurisdiction because Joan had been captured within his diocese, a dubious assertion since Compiègne actually lay within the diocese of Soissons. More problematically, Cauchon was a paid English partisan, having fled his see when it returned to French control. Canon law prohibited judges with personal interest in a case, yet caution brushed aside these concerns. The trial proceeded without key legal protections Joan should have been afforded. She was denied counsel, though church law required advocates for the accused in heresy trials, especially for minors. Joan was 19. The proceedings were conducted in French but recorded in Latin, allowing subtle distortions in translation. When Joan requested that an equal number of pro-French clerics be added to the tribunal, a reasonable request for balance, Cauchon refused. Most tellingly, the court never established a prima facie case that Joan had actually committed heresy. Instead, the interrogations began immediately, assuming guilt and seeking admissions to confirm it. For 15 consecutive days, Joan faced relentless questioning designed to entrap rather than illuminate. Sessions lasted 5 to 6 hours, with up to 60 men firing questions simultaneously, changing topics abruptly to confuse her and setting theological traps that would have challenged the most educated minds in Europe. Yet Joan displayed remarkable composure and intellectual agility. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a theological trap, as church doctrine held that no one could be certain of their salvation, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there. I would be the saddest person in the world if I knew I was not in His grace." The Dominican theologian Jean Lemaitre, who reluctantly served as inquisitor at the trial, whispered to colleagues, "A great answer that would illuminate a great cleric." When questions turned to her voices, Joan maintained that Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret spoke to her regularly, providing guidance and comfort. The court seized on these claims, attempting to prove the voices were demons masquerading as saints. They questioned minute details, the language the voices spoke, whether they had hair, what they wore, seeking contradictions that never materialized. Repeatedly, Joan requested that her case be sent to the Pope for judgment, as was her right under canon law. Each time, the court stenographer was instructed not to record her appeal. In the French minutes, telltale gaps appear where her words were omitted from the official Latin record. The most persistent line of questioning concerned Joan's male attire. Her decision to wear men's clothing, practical armor in battle, and protection against sexual assault in prison became central to the prosecution's case. Church authorities cited Deuteronomy's prohibition against cross-dressing as evidence of her defiance of scriptural authority. Joan defended herself eloquently. "For the dress and arms that I have worn them by the permission of God. I have done nothing against God or the faith, however you may have sentenced me." As weeks passed, Joan's physical condition deteriorated. Kept in chains, denied proper rest, subjected to constant psychological pressure, she nonetheless maintained her core assertions. Her voices were divine, her mission was holy, and she submitted to God above all earthly authorities. By April, frustrated by her resilience, Cauchon ordered the preparation of a formal indictment containing 70 articles accusing Joan of sorcery, idolatry, invoking demons, bloodthirstiness, blasphemy, schism, and heresy. These were later condensed to 12 articles that were sent to the University of Paris for evaluation. Predictably, the university's pro-English theologians condemned them as heretical. Armed with this opinion, Cauchon intensified pressure on Joan to submit. On May 9th, she was taken to the torture chamber and shown the instruments that would be used if she refused to recant. Though terrified, she maintained, "Truly, if you were to tear my limbs apart and separate my soul from my body, I would not tell you anything different." The final act of this judicial farce came on May 24, 1431. Joan was taken to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen and placed on a scaffold before a large crowd. Nearby stood 2 carts, one bearing officials prepared to return her to prison if she recanted, the other carrying the executioner and wood for her burning if she refused. Exhausted, isolated, and facing imminent death, Joan finally broke. When presented with a confession to sign, she agreed to abjure her claims about the voices. As she could not read, the document was read aloud to her, but evidence suggests what was actually read differed significantly from what she was then forced to mark with a cross as her signature. The actual document, which survives, required her to confess that she had seduced the people, that I have made myself a divineress and a false prophet, that I wish to provoke superstition, to adore evil spirits and invoke them, and blasphemed God, his saints, and his sacraments. Having secured her confession, caution sentenced Joan not to death, but to perpetual imprisonment, with the bread of sorrow and the water of anguish. She was returned to her English cell rather than transferred to an ecclesiastical prison as required by law. There, the final betrayal awaited. Her guards removed her female attire while she slept and left only male clothing. When Joan demanded her dress back, they refused. After several days without clothing at all, facing continued harassment from her guards, Joan put on the men's clothes, technically violating her abjuration. Cauchon rushed to her cell with witnesses. "What has happened since Thursday?" he demanded, well aware of the circumstances that had forced her hand. "God has shown me through Saints Catherine and Margaret the great sorrow of my betrayal," Joan replied with renewed conviction. "It was fear of the fire that made me say what I said. Rather than remain in chains, I would rather die." This relapse was all Cauchon needed. On May 29th, the court reconvened and declared Joan a relapsed heretic, subject to death by burning. The verdict had been inevitable from the start. The only surprise was the circuitous path required to reach it. Dawn broke clear and warm over Rouen on May 30th, 1431. In her cell, Joan received the news of her imminent execution with the calm of one who had long anticipated this moment. She requested confession and communion, which Cauchon granted, a telling inconsistency, as church law prohibited sacraments for condemned heretics. By mid-morning, a cart carried her to the old market square where 3 scaffolds had been erected, one for the ecclesiastical and civil dignitaries, one for the preaching of a final sermon, and one housing a massive pile of wood surrounding a tall stake. Thousands of spectators, English soldiers, French collaborators, curious townspeople, filled the square held back by English troops. Joan wore a simple long garment and a mitre-shaped paper hat inscribed with the words, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." As the Dominican friar Nicolas Midi delivered a final condemnatory sermon, she knelt in prayer, calling on her saints for strength and repeatedly invoking Jesus. When the sermon concluded, Cauchon read the formal sentence abandoning her to secular authority, the technical formulation by which the Church maintained the fiction that it did not directly execute heretics. No formal trial by secular authorities followed. The English officials simply ordered, "Take her. Do your duty." As guards led her to the stake, Joan requested a cross. An English soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks tied together, which she tucked into her dress. A crucifix was brought from the nearby church of Saint Sauveur, which she embraced until the moment she was bound to the stake. The executioner lit the wood. As flames began to rise, Joan called out, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." Witnesses reported that she continued to affirm the reality of her voices and the truth of her mission until smoke overwhelmed her. An English soldier who had sworn to add a faggot to her pyre reportedly threw down his wood and ran from the square, claiming he had seen a white dove rise from the flames. Others swore they saw the name Jesus written in the fire. When it was over, the executioner was ordered to rake back the coals to expose Joan's charred body to the crowd, proving she had not escaped. Her remains were then burned twice more before being cast into the Seine River. An extraordinary measure intended to prevent the collection of relics from one the English feared might be venerated as a martyr despite her condemnation. Bishop Cauchon never received the Archbishopric of Rouen he had been promised for his services. The English captain who had said, "We have burned a saint," proved more prophetic than he knew. Within 25 years, the political winds shifted dramatically. The English were driven from most of France. Charles VII, secure on his throne and seeking to remove the stain of having been crowned at the instigation of a condemned heretic, ordered an investigation into Joan's trial. In 1456, a rehabilitation trial was convened. After hearing testimony from 115 witnesses, including Joan's companions in arms, villagers from Domremy, and even some who had participated in the original trial, the court annulled the verdict against her. The proceedings revealed the extent of procedural violations, falsified evidence, and political pressure that had characterized Cauchon's tribunal. The rehabilitation verdict declared, "We pronounce that these trial articles were corrupted with fraud, calumny, malice, and manifest contradiction, and that certain passages of her confessions were wickedly distorted and fraudulently omitted. We thereby annul, invalidate, and void these trials and sentences as being full of fraud, calumny, iniquity, and contradiction." Yet even this vindication contained an element of political calculation. Charles VII needed Joan's rehabilitation to secure his own legitimacy. The Church needed to distance itself from a tainted process that had condemned a woman increasingly viewed as a holy martyr. Once again, Joan became an instrument in the hands of the powerful, her memory shaped to serve institutional needs. The final irony came centuries later. In 1909, Joan was beatified by the Catholic Church. In 1920, 489 years after burning her as a heretic, the Church declared her a saint. The institution that had condemned her to the flames now placed her among its most venerated figures. The girl once accused of defying ecclesiastical authority became one of Catholicism's most popular saints. Her feast day celebrated on May 30th, the anniversary of her execution. Joan of Arc's journey from the fields of Domremy to the fires of Rouen represents one of history's most profound betrayals, not simply by individuals or institutions, but by the very ideals those institutions claimed to embody. She died not for failing her faith, but for following it too purely, too directly, without the mediating control of those who claimed exclusive right to interpret divine will. Her tragedy illuminates the eternal conflict between power and truth, between institutions and the principles they profess to serve. The Church that burned her as a heretic later canonized her as a saint, not because its understanding of God had changed, but because its political necessities had shifted. In our own age, when institutions still betray their stated values for political expediency, when the powerful still silence voices that challenge their authority, Joan's story resonates with uncomfortable relevance. She stands as testament to the courage required to follow one's conscience even unto death, and as warning of how readily sacred principles are sacrificed on the altar of institutional self-preservation. The Maid of Orleans, betrayed by king and church alike, finally received the vindication she foresaw. "I know well that the English will kill me," she had told her judges, "but 100 years from now, a greater judge than you will find me innocent." History proved an even greater judge than she imagined. 5 centuries later, the peasant girl condemned by the mighty stands among the most recognized and venerated figures in Western civilization. While those who condemned her are remembered, if at all, only for their role